Hey everyone, KTChamberlain here. It's April 16th, and you know what today is? It's Charlie Chaplin's birthday. If he was alive today, he'd be 124 years old, but hey, that's not stopping me from doing a birthday special to one of my biggest inspirations. Charlie Chaplin was born on April 16th, 1889 in London, England. Chaplin grew up dirt poor throughout his childhood in London. He was the son of Spencer and Hannah Chaplin, which were involved in theater groups. Between 1896 and 1910, Chaplin went through a series of difficulties and hardships in some way, shape, or form. For instance, at the age of 7, Chaplin was taken away from his mother to an orphanage, or workhouse as it's often referred to, which is another way of saying poorhouse in British terminology. And even though he was only there for a year, it was something he'd never forget and would recreate in 1921. More about that later. In 1901, Chaplin's alcoholic father died of cirrhosis. However, Chaplin knew very little of him, sang on stage, left after he was born, and died of drink. That's about it. In 1903, Chaplin made the most difficult and painful decision of his life. He had to commit his mother to an insane asylum because she developed psychosis, and as a result was declared insane. With the help of his older half-brother Sidney Chaplin, he got a small break when he was hired by Fred Karno to be part of his prestigious comedy group in 1908. In vaudeville, Chaplin began making a name for himself, small though it was at the time. In 1910, at the age of 21, Chaplin went to the United States for the first time while on tour with Karno's vaudeville group. In 1913, when Chaplin was in Butte, Montana, he received a telegram in which it offered him an acting job of $150 a week from producer Max Sennett at Keystone Studios in California. Most people tend to think that Chaplin's silver screen debut was in Kid Auto Races at Venice, but in actuality it was Making a Living, where he made his first film appearance. The film that followed was Kid Auto Races at Venice, in which Chaplin's iconic character, the Little Tramp, made his first screen debut in February of 1914. He came up with the tramp by experimenting in the costume department. The toothbrush mustache of his, which Adolf Hitler would eventually copy and bastardize at the same time, was ironically fake. Chaplin eventually got to direct the short subjects for the remainder of his time at Keystone and onward. Now, in late 1914, Chaplin wanted to advance his career even further. He requested $1,000 a week, but Sennett refused, claiming that it was too large. So, when S&A Film Manufacturing Company offered him $12.50 a week and a signing bonus of $10,000, Chaplin couldn't resist. From 1915 onward, Chaplin became an international and cultural phenomenon, even during the First World War, when German U-boats targeted ships bound for England and France. Either those ships had special decoys or convoys, or they got lucky a lot. In 1915, when his contract with S&A ended, he requested a signing bonus of $150,000. Mutual Film Corporation offered him a weekly salary of $10,000 a week and a yearly salary of $670,000, making Chaplin at age 26 one of the highest paid people in the world. That's right, folks, Chaplin made that much money in 1915 at the age of 26. To put that in today's money, you'd have to multiply by at least 20. In 1917, Chaplin made two silent films that were, for the first time in his career, social commentaries: Easy Street and The Immigrant. In 1918, Chaplin made a 45-minute classic film called Shoulder Arms, in which the tramp was placed in the trenches of World War I. He was about to scrap the film because at the time it seemed potentially dangerous to make a comedic film about a war that was still going on at the time. That was, however, until his good friend Douglas Fairbanks Sr. saw the film and laughed hysterically. So, Chaplin continued with it, and it of course was highly successful in October 1918, boosting the sale of war bonds and further highlighted Chaplin as a comedic genius. In 1919, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks Sr., Mary Pickford, and D.W. Griffith together formed United Artists. For the first time in film history, creative people like them really got to have a say in their films. To them, it was sort of like their version of the Declaration of Independence. In 1921, Chaplin made his first feature-length film, The Kid. It was his most poignant and heartfelt film and was influenced by his own childhood, as shown in this scene. A thing I should point out about this film, other than the story, comedy, and drama, is the music. Chaplin by this time pretty much composed the music in almost all his films, The Kid being one of them, and I gotta say, Chaplin's musical score in The Kid is some of the best music I've ever heard in a film, silent or sound. At times it can be cheerful and lighthearted, and other times it can be a real tearjerker. It was highly successful, and during that year, Chaplin returned to England for the first time since roughly 1910 to attend the London premiere of the film. While he was in fact greeted rapturously by his fellow Brits, there were some who resented and criticized Chaplin for not fighting in World War I. In Chaplin's defense, though, he did say he registered for the draft, but they never called him. Also, he did help with war bond drives when America entered World War I in 1917, and like I said, shoulder arms helped boost the sale of war bond drives, so take what you can get, people. The way I see it, I suspect that maybe King George V during World War I said, "No, I will not draft Chaplin and risk his premature death. The world needs laughter, especially at a time like this." In 1923, Chaplin made A Woman of Paris, which was the first movie he made that did not star him as the little tramp, or for that matter, him as the star. It starred Edna Purviance, who by this time had been in a lot of Chaplin's films as a leading lady, and it was intended to make her a star, but sadly the movie didn't do so well that year, and her acting career never made movie star status, though Chaplin did keep her on company payroll until she died. I imagine it did not do well at the box office partly because it was ahead of its time when general audiences were so accustomed to seeing Chaplin starring in all his movies since 1914, and they were comedies at that. On another note, A Woman of Paris was Chaplin's first attempt at a dramatic film instead of a comedy, and his audience at the time were rather disappointed and were like, "Where's Chaplin? Where's the tramp?" This was a very painful setback for Chaplin. To give you an example of what that was like, it's like when Walt Disney made Snow White in 1937. It was highly successful, but then the films that followed it in 1940, Pinocchio and Fantasia, didn't do so well that year, despite their ambition, lavish, and attention to detail. Later on, A Woman of Paris would be considered Chaplin's lost masterpiece. In 1925, Chaplin made one of his most classic films, The Gold Rush. Ironically, it was inspired by the 1895 Klondike Gold Rush and the Donner Party. Talk about an odd source for comedic gold. No pun intended. In 1928, he made The Circus, which was another classic film of his, and one I saw in Turner Classic Movies. The Circus is among my top 3 circus-related films, the others being Walt Disney's Dumbo in 1941, and Cecil B. DeMille's The Greatest Show on Earth in 1952. Also in 1928, Chaplin sold all his stocks and shares just 1 year before the Great Depression hit. Well played, Charlie. In 1929, at the first ever Academy Awards, Chaplin received an honorary Oscar in relation to The Circus, though one wonders why it wasn't for Best Picture of that year, but I don't know. In spite of its success, The Circus is only mentioned a few times in his 1964 published memoir, my autobiography, and bear in mind it's roughly 500 pages. With the advent of the Power Cinephone and the RCA sound system, motion pictures like The Jazz Singer and Steamboat Willie ushered in the sound era. Even though Chaplin survived the transition from silent to sound, he still found himself in an artistic dilemma. The popularity of his friends Douglas Fairbanks Sr. and Mary Pickford, both of whom were a married couple at this time, was dwindling with each new film, and D.W. Griffith himself in terms of popularity pretty much faded away by this time. And this was the same man who made Birth of a Nation, Intolerance, and Broken Blossoms. Even though Chaplin's voice was pretty good, he didn't want to give the tramp a voice because he feared it would limit the tramp's worldwide appeal or ruin it altogether. Silent film was legally dead by 1929, but Chaplin went ahead with his 1931 film, City Lights. This was the first silent-talkie hybrid Chaplin experimented with, and although he didn't embrace sound at the time, he did however find one good benefit, was that he could record the music and integrate it with the film, rather than sending out an orchestra or a pianist or organist or whatever to play the music at the theaters like how it was with all silent pictures, short or long, up until 1929. In 1932, after the success of City Lights, Charlie met who would later become his next leading lady and third wife, Paulette Goddard, although she was formerly Levy at the time. Goddard was a very obscure actress at the time up until 1936. With the problems of the Great Depression, Chaplin really felt for the millions of men who were unemployed and felt he had to do something for the working class in the form of a social commentary. So, in 1936, he released another silent-talkie hybrid, Modern Times. It had the little tramp working on the assembly line and showed the terrible effects of Fordism coupled with the Depression. This film also pulled Paulette Goddard out of obscurity, and it's also worth mentioning that she was one of the finalists considered for the role of Scarlett O'Hara in David O. Selznick's Technicolor classic, Gone with the Wind.
Why, Charles Hamilton, you handsome old thing, you. Did you think it was kind of you to bring this good-looking brother of yours down here to break our poor, simple country hearts? Listen, I want to eat barbecue with you, Charles Hamilton, so don't you go philandering with any other girl, because I'm mighty jealous.
In modern times, the Little Tramp sings for the first and only time on screen in mock Italian. Sadly though, Modern Times received mixed reviews and didn't do so well at the box office, but today we look at Modern Times very differently and really appreciate it for its comedy, wit, and storytelling. In 1938, with war brewing in Europe, Chaplin decided he had to make another satirical comedy, but this time against the likes of Hitler and Mussolini. People at the time thought he was crazy. Isolationist Americans tried to discourage him. Hell, even other movie studios tried to talk him out of it. But Chaplin stuck to his guns and went ahead with it. In 1939, when Chaplin was 50, his good friend Douglas Fairbanks Sr., the same man who encouraged him to complete Shoulder Arms 21 years earlier, died in his sleep of a heart attack. The loss of a good friend like Fairbanks was something he'd never forget. In October of 1940, Chaplin's first all-talkie film, The Great Dictator, premiered and was a box office success despite its controversy, and was Chaplin's most successful film, and was nominated for 5 Academy Awards including Best Picture, Best Actor, and Best Original Screenplay. It carried a lot of weight.
You mean I will carry weight?
The film starts off as a nod back to his 1918 film Shoulder Arms. In the film, Chaplin plays 2 roles, the tramp, the barber of the ghetto, and Adenoid Hinkle, the caricature of Adolf Hitler. Now, I know there's some debate amongst Chaplin fans and historians as to whether if the barber played by Chaplin is the little tramp, but the way I look at this debate is this. If he looks like the tramp, walks like the tramp, dresses like the tramp, and has the same subtleties and timing as the tramp, then it must be the tramp. Clear and simple. Chaplin himself refers to him as the tramp. What more do you wish? And for that matter, who are we as fans, admirers, and historians to say otherwise in that regard? In this film, Chaplin not only broke his own movie silence, but also the silence of the world. At first, they thought he was crazy for making The Great Dictator, but when the Second World War broke out, they thought of him as a genius, and a comedic David to counter an anti-Semitic Goliath. The Great Dictator was the real last outing of Chaplin's beloved character, the Little Tramp, and he thought to himself in a nutshell, if the tramp's going to go out talking, let this be the film to do so. Chaplin and Hitler had more in common than just a toothbrush mustache. They were born on the same week, of the same month, of the same year. One example is in an anecdote that goes, in 1914, Charlie Chaplin became a movie star as the Little Tramp. 1914, Adolf Hitler was a tramp. Also, for the record, Chaplin had the toothbrush mustache first, but as I mentioned earlier, it was ironically fake. Hitler in 1914 had more of a walrus-like mustache.
The time has come!
Chaplin would have been the first person to portray Hitler on film, but Moe Howard of the Three Stooges beat him to the punch 9 months prior with the short You Nazi Spy. While it beat The Great Dictator to the punch in early 1940, it didn't have the same satirical impact as The Great Dictator did.
First you start a beer putsch.
How? You put your beer down and wait for the pretzels.
By the time of The Great Dictator, Chaplin and Goddard's marriage was on a downward spiral and would divorce in 1942. But unlike Mildred Harris and Lita Gray, Chaplin's first 2 ex-wives that I stupidly forgot to mention earlier, Paulette Goddard was the only one who didn't try to claim a lot of money out of him in the divorce. Chaplin's next film was surprisingly a comedy of murders based on an idea by Orson Welles, which became Monsieur Verdoux in 1947. In Monsieur Verdoux, Charlie Chaplin plays the suave and sophisticated lady killer, Henri Verdoux. He marries women, kills them, and takes their money, all to support his actual family. When he's tried for his crimes, he defends himself saying that as a mass killer, he's an amateur by comparison to many nations. This raised the paradox of one murder makes a villain, millions a hero. Despite its comedy, drama, and thought-provoking morals, Monsieur Verdoux didn't do very well at the box office, partly because Chaplin's popularity was starting to go downhill, although it should be pointed out that it was nominated for Best Screenplay Oscar of that year. Now, I'd strongly argue that Monsieur Verdoux is one of his most underrated films. Granted, it's not as underrated as, say, A Woman of Paris, but still, it tends to fly under the radar of most Chaplin fans. In 1952, Chaplin completed Limelight and went to London for its premiere, but it was during the McCarthy era and people like Joe McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover believed he was a communist, which was false. When Hoover learned of Chaplin leaving for England, Hoover, being the opportunist that he was, pulled some strings to have Chaplin exiled from the United States. As far as I can tell, J. Edgar Hoover pretty much had a vendetta towards Chaplin ever since 1917 when he saw The Immigrant. Well, at least that's my theory, I should say. Hoover, like the Nazis, also believed Chaplin was a Jew, which was also false. As a result of this crushing blow, Chaplin decided not to premiere Limelight in the United States, but this attributed to why said film also flopped at the box office. It would not be shown in the United States until 1972, where in 1973 it won the Oscar for Best Musical Score. Speaking of Limelight, it is worth mentioning that it had former silent movie star Buster Keaton in the film with Chaplin. Chaplin, with his fourth wife, Una, along with their children, briefly returned to England, and after that they resided happily in Vevey, Switzerland. While we're on the subject, I should also take the time to talk a little bit about Una O'Neill Chaplin. Una met Chaplin when she was 18 years old and married him that same year in 1943. They had 8 children together and remained happily married until the end of Chaplin's life. However, after his divorce from Paulette Goddard and prior to meeting Una O'Neill, Chaplin had an alleged sexual encounter with Joan Barry and resulted in a paternity lawsuit. According to my research, she was willing to agree to a settlement of $100,000, but Chaplin felt he had to prove his innocence, not just to himself, but also Una as well, by having Joan Barry agree to a blood test. Now, even though the blood test proved that Chaplin was not the father of Barry's child, and the courts ruled in his favor, Barry's lawyer demanded a retrial, and to make matters worse, the state of California did not allow the blood test to be used in evidence in the second trial, and sadly Chaplin lost, meaning that he had to support Joan Barry's daughter until she was 21. This paternity lawsuit later became regarded as a major miscarriage of justice. If there was a silver lining in this moment of Chaplin's life, it was that Una knew Charlie was innocent and was there for him for loving support. After being exiled from the United States, Charlie Chaplin made another film in 1957 called A King in New York, in which Chaplin played an exiled king from Russia in New York, and for the most part satirized HUAC, House of Un-American Activities Committee, and its unjust methods. Despite that, though, A King in New York, it's kind of split opinions, and it's one Chaplin fans and historians either love it or hate it. In 1967, Chaplin made his very last film, A Countess from Hong Kong. It starred Marlon Brando and Sophia Loren, though sadly, like A Woman of Paris, Modern Times, Monsieur Verdoux, Limelight, and A King of New York, A Countess from Hong Kong didn't do so well at the box office during its first run. Charlie Chaplin's popularity was at an all-time low. Now, even though all glory is fleeting, sometimes it can make the greatest comeback. In Monsieur Verdoux, Chaplin says,
"Nothing is permanent in this wicked world, not even our troubles."
And if you think about it for a second, it's actually true. On April 16, 1972, at the 43rd Annual Academy Awards, Charlie Chaplin was given an honorary Oscar for the incalculable effect he has had on making motion pictures the art form of this century. That's got to be the best birthday present to give to an 83-year-old man. To make matters better, Chaplin received the longest standing ovation in the history of the Academy Awards. On December 25th, Christmas Day, 1977, Charlie Chaplin died at the age of 88 of a stroke. He may be gone, but his legacy still to this day lives on and is remembered by people who love the greater things in life: film, comedy, art, music, drama, depth, philosophy, passion, romance, and so much more. He was truly one of the biggest Hollywood legends, not only of film history, but of all time. He's my biggest inspiration because he made more people laugh than anyone in history, showed that a person's humanity is greater than their inhumanity. He influenced and inspired my other inspirations, Walt Disney, Jim Henson, Don Bluth, and so on, and I can strongly relate to someone like Chaplin. I talked a little bit about that in one of my Chamberlain Court Q&A videos, so I won't bore you with that here. Sometimes you can spot an homage to him from time to time in such things as a Mickey Mouse cartoon. To an episode of My Life as a Teenage Robot.
One day, the machines went wild. He was horribly mauled. It was tragic.
Is that your dad?
Yeah, he got better. I gotta go.
I should also point out that in 1992, filmmaker Richard Attenborough made a biopic based on the aforementioned book, my autobiography, called Chaplin, and it starred Robert Downey Jr. portraying Charlie Chaplin himself. When I saw the film, I didn't see Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark or Sherlock Holmes. I saw him as Charlie Chaplin. He was that good. It's one of my favorite movies of all time, and it's got a great cast. Paul Reese, Kevin Kline, Kevin Dunn, Dan Aykroyd, Anthony Hopkins, James Woods, and Chaplin's own daughter, Geraldine, portraying her grandmother, Hannah. Now that's pretty cool and something you don't normally see in movies based on true stories. If you haven't seen it yet, I'd strongly recommend giving it a watch. It's one of those movies that, when you reach its end, will make you say, wow. The same kind of wow as if you just sat through a great symphony. I showed this movie to my mom last year, and she was blown away by Chaplin's life. And so, folks, that was my birthday special to Charlie Chaplin. I don't know how many people watching this video has seen the films I mentioned, but definitely give them a watch if you have the chance or if the opportunity presents itself. Before I end this special, I have one last thing worth mentioning. Come February 2nd, 2014, it will mark Charlie Chaplin's centennial when he made his silver screen debut in Making a Living. If Turner Classic Movies hosts an event for that in Hollywood when that day comes, I'd be honored to attend. I mean, I've never attended a centennial before in my young life, and I wouldn't miss a centennial observance of Chaplin's legacy for the world. I could imagine all of Hollywood brass showing up for that once-in-a-lifetime event. I could see film historians, critics, Robert Downey Jr., Richard Attenborough, Chaplin's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and yes, even great-great-grandchildren there, and that'd be just to name a few. This is KTChamberlain, remembering Charlie Chaplin on his 124th birthday. Thank you for watching. And remember, in the end, everything is a gag. For a day without laughter is a wasted day. And that you'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile.
You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you